July 1942. The sun had barely risen over the endless dunes of the Libyan desert, painting the sand in streaks of gold and crimson, when Sergeant Alec Thorne gripped the wheel of the overloaded Willis Jeep. The springs groaned under the weight of 5 Vickers K machine guns, a dozen jerry cans, and ammunition drums that rattled with every bump in the featureless terrain. Beside him, Corporal Harris strained to keep the rear-mounted guns aimed over the edge of the chassis, while Private Mason clutched a Lewis bomb, its deadly thermite core tucked carefully under his arm. The 3 men were cramped together, sand and sweat sticking to their uniforms, yet none dared voice complaint. They had a mission that would demand more than comfort. Every mile they covered felt endless, the sun beating down on the desert like a relentless judge. Thorne squinted at the horizon, consulting the sun compass, knowing that one miscalculation could leave them lost in the vast emptiness behind enemy lines. The wind whipped up grains of sand that scoured their faces, but the Jeep pressed on, a lumbering beast of metal and firepower, carrying the promise of destruction to the Axis airfields they had trained to strike. For months, these vehicles had been whispered about in Cairo mess halls and officer quarters, tales of a small British unit capable of tearing through enemy aircraft with a speed and audacity that no conventional air raid could match. Thorne imagined the targets waiting ahead. Rows of Messerschmitts and Ju-87s, glinting under the harsh sun, engines cold, crews long gone to lunch or patrol. With a hand steadying the wheel and a mind razor-focused on the mission, he felt a strange exhilaration. For men, one fragile Jeep, yet armed to strike like an entire squadron. This wasn't just a raid. It was a revolution in motion, a gamble that relied on courage, skill, and the precise placement of firepower. As the Jeep climbed another dune, the men caught sight of a distant glint, the first sign of the airfield's perimeter. Their hearts hammered in unison, adrenaline surging, yet there was no time for fear. The desert stretched endlessly around them, a blank canvas for the violence they were about to unleash. In that moment, every rattling jerry can, every groaning spring, every clatter of ammunition drums became part of something larger than themselves. Over the next 12 months, they would drive these mechanical monsters across sand and sun, leaving fire and smoke in their wake, toppling hundreds of aircraft and reshaping the war in ways no general had anticipated. This Jeep, crammed with men and machines, was more than a vehicle. It was the embodiment of audacity, innovation, and the desperate genius of men willing to turn the desert itself into a battlefield. The heat shimmered off the endless dunes as the roar of distant engines cut across the desert sky, a grim reminder of the power that ruled these lands. The Luftwaffe's Ju-87 Stukas swooped down with terrifying precision, dive-bombing British supply convoys and leaving twisted wreckage and burned-out trucks in their wake. High above, Messerschmitt 109s patrolled relentlessly, silhouettes darting like hawks over the sand, ready to rip into any RAF fighter daring to challenge their dominance. For the men on the ground, each convoy was a gamble, each flight a fragile thread of hope against an enemy whose presence was absolute and unyielding. Britain's conventional responses were failing. High-altitude bombing raids offered the illusion of retaliation, but in reality, they were wildly inefficient. Desert airfields sprawled across miles of open sand, aircraft scattered like toys in the sun, and for every enemy plane that might be destroyed, the cost in pilots, fuel, and precious aircraft was punishing. Each loss was not just a number, it was a gap in an already overstretched force, a step closer to defeat. The men in Cairo and London knew the grim truth. They could not replace pilots fast enough, nor could factories keep up with the demands of war while the enemy ruled the skies. Something had to change. Britain needed a weapon that could strike back where bombs failed, a way to take the fight to the Luftwaffe without paying the devastating price of conventional air raids. The desert had become a hunting ground for Axis air power, and only audacity, innovation, and a new kind of daring could level the skies and turn the tide. The night fell over the desert like a heavy, suffocating blanket, and Lieutenant David Sterling crouched among the dunes, staring at the faint outlines of enemy airfields in the distance. His plan was simple in theory. Small, Elite teams of men would infiltrate the Axis lines under cover of darkness, planting explosives directly on parked aircraft. In practice, it was a nightmare. The first attempt, Operation Squatter, in November 1941, quickly became chaos. A vicious sandstorm whipped across the desert, scattering men across miles of featureless sand. Equipment containers were ripped from parachutes, demolition charges soaked and useless. Of the 55 men who jumped that night, only 21 managed to return. Not a single enemy plane had been touched. The mission was a brutal lesson in the unforgiving reality of the desert and the immense risks of unconventional warfare. Sterling refused to abandon the idea. If stealth and courage alone could not win this fight, they would need a weapon designed for precision and devastation. That weapon came in the form of the Lewis bomb. Small, compact, and lethal. Each bomb carried a pound of Nobel 88 plastic explosive, a thermite core that would ignite fuel with terrifying efficiency, and a carefully calibrated time fuse. One man could carry enough to destroy a dozen aircraft, a force multiplier that transformed the impossible into the achievable. By December, Sterling's faith was rewarded. A small team, moving under the cloak of night, struck their first target with deadly efficiency. Lewis bombs found their marks in cockpits and fuel tanks, turning rows of enemy planes into fiery infernos. No casualties were suffered by the raiders, and the concept that had seemed so desperate only weeks before proved devastatingly effective. In the harsh expanse of the desert, courage alone would not win the war, but courage armed with ingenuity and invention could. The SAS had found its edge, and the desert would never be the same. The desert night had grown colder, but the danger was far from cooling. German airfields were no longer quiet, isolated targets. They had adapted. Guards patrolled every perimeter, floodlights scanned the dunes, and machine guns bristled along every likely approach. Foot infiltration, once the daring hallmark of the SAS, had become a slow march toward near-certain death. Sterling and his men knew they needed more than courage and explosives. They needed speed, firepower, and protection in a single mobile package. The solution emerged in the form of the Willis Jeep, stripped down and transformed into a desert predator. Vickers K machine guns, once defensive weapons on British bombers, were mounted on swivel pedestals and fixed points around the Jeep. Each vehicle carried a handful of Lewis bombs, ready to ignite parked aircraft in bursts of fire and smoke. But it was not enough to arm them. They had to survive the desert itself. Windscreens were removed to eliminate sun glare that could betray their position from miles away. Radiator grills were cut open to keep engines from boiling under the relentless heat. Extra jerry cans extended their range, water condensers recycled every drop they could, and the Bagnalled sun compass ensured that even under the desert stars, navigation remained precise. By the time the modifications were complete, the Jeeps were unrecognizable. Fully loaded, each weighed between 3,800 and 4,200 pounds, groaning under the weight of weapons, fuel, and water. Yet, in that cumbersome mass lurked terrifying potential. In the hands of a skilled driver and a disciplined crew, these Jeeps could weave between rows of enemy aircraft at speed, unleashing torrents of bullets and explosives in minutes. Where foot teams had once spent hours risking life and limb, the desert was no longer a passive canvas. It had become a battlefield on wheels, and the SAS had reinvented war. 1942 stretched across the Libyan desert like an endless, obsidian sea, broken only by the faint glimmer of stars. In the blackness, 18 Willis Jeeps crawled across 50 miles of open sand, their engines a low, steady hum that seemed almost alive, synchronized with the tense rhythm of the men inside. 60 soldiers, SAS trained, seasoned by months of preparation and small raids, huddled into the cramped frames of the vehicles. Each Jeep groaned under the weight of 5 Vickers K machine guns, jerry cans brimming with fuel, ammunition drums rattling with every bump, and Lewis bombs tucked carefully into storage racks. The men were silent, their faces painted with sand and sweat, every sense alert to the slightest movement in the vast emptiness. The desert offered no landmarks, no shadows, and no mercy for the unprepared. Yet for Sterling's men, this nothingness was both a shield and a canvas. a stage on which audacity could turn into triumph. For months, they had trained for this moment. Each turn of the wheel, each burst of the Vickers K, had been drilled until instinct was the only guide. Still, nerves crackled like static through the convoy. "Keep formation," Sterling's voice whispered through a radio, barely audible over the engines. One mistake, and it's over. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath. It was a rare calm, but that calm concealed the danger that lay ahead. The airfield at Sitihish was a fortified prize. German sentries patrolled the perimeter. Floodlights traced predictable arcs across sand dunes, and machine gun nests bristled behind every fence and mound. The Axis had adapted to the audacity of previous SAS foot raids, and the risk of discovery had never been higher. Then, almost impossibly, fortune intervened. The distant glow of runway lights flickered to life, not because of alert sentries, but for a Luftwaffe bomber returning from a late mission. The lights spilled across the desert, illuminating row after row of parked aircraft, their metallic surfaces catching the moonlight, silver and black glinting in the night. Sterling saw it instantly and flicked a green flare into the air, a signal that shattered the tense quiet like a gunshot. Engines roared to life as the jeeps surged forward, moving as one unit in a deadly V formation. The desert, for a moment, became a corridor of fire and shadow, the jeeps weaving between dunes and sand channels, guns trained on their targets, Lewis bombs ready for the final act. The first volley of bullets struck with terrifying efficiency. Vickers K machine guns barked in synchronized bursts, tracer rounds arcing across the airfield and igniting fuel tanks with sudden, violent flare. The Lewis bombs were deployed in tandem, each one exploding in a flash that lit the desert night, setting aircraft ablaze in rapid succession. Messerschmitt 109s, Ju-87 Stukas, Junkers transports, all were turned into columns of smoke and fire before crews could react. The fireball engulfed planes, sending molten metal and flames dancing across the sand. It was chaos, but it was the chaos Sterling had trained them for, the very reason these vehicles had been stripped, fortified, and armed. The SAS jeeps moved like living predators, agile and relentless, turning a concentrated strike into a symphony of destruction. For 15 minutes, time warped. The men in the lead jeeps fired, reloaded, and fired again. Those in the rear covered the flanks, ensuring no aircraft escaped untouched. The roar of gunfire, the hiss and crackle of exploding bombs, and the smell of scorched fuel filled the cab of each jeep. Lance Bombardier John Robson, barely 21, operated his machine gun with the steady hands of a seasoned veteran, despite the chaos around him. A burst from a defensive German MG-42 caught him as he adjusted his aim, and he fell, his life extinguished in an instant. The loss was brutal, but the mission pressed on. French volunteer André Zernheld, another brave soul, would be killed the next day during withdrawal, a grim reminder that even the most daring operations carried a human cost. Yet the overwhelming success at Sitihish could not be denied. 37 enemy aircraft destroyed in a quarter of an hour, achieved with precision and near-zero casualties among the remaining raiders. The raid was not an isolated event. It marked the beginning of a series of lightning strikes that would redefine desert warfare. Weeks later, at Bauch, SAS jeeps rolled into the night once more, Lewis bombs and machine guns turning aircraft into targets, as if the desert itself were complicit in their mission. El Daba saw 14 aircraft destroyed against a backdrop of heavily fortified positions, proving that even upgraded German defenses could not stop a determined, mobile force. Bonina Airfield, a critical Luftwaffe repair hub near Benghazi, fell to Sterling and his men with a calculated efficiency that left enemy command scrambling. Each raid reinforced a terrifying truth for the Axis. The desert was no longer empty, no longer a safe rear for their air power, and British ingenuity had found a way to strike where bombs had failed. The effectiveness of the armed jeeps lay not only in the destruction they caused, but in the economy of force they represented. A full RAF bombing operation might take dozens of planes, hundreds of men, and enormous quantities of fuel and ordnance to achieve results that a single jeep raid could accomplish in minutes. One small vehicle, in the hands of well-trained soldiers, could wipe out multiple aircraft, disrupt enemy supply lines, and forced German commanders to divert troops from frontline operations to defend airfields. The cost-benefit analysis was stark. The British lost one man and a few vehicles, while the Axis lost the equivalent of multiple squadrons. The psychological impact was just as severe. Every desert airstrip now had to be defended, every aircraft guarded, every soldier redirected from the front lines to watch over rear areas that had once been considered safe. Britain had found a way to multiply its impact far beyond the numbers it could commit, a lesson in ingenuity that would echo through the rest of the war. Inside the jeeps, adrenaline coursed through the veins of each soldier, a mixture of fear, excitement, and sheer focus. Sergeant Alec Thorne recalled the first time the convoy hit Sitihish, the heat of the sand beneath the tires, the flash of bombs lighting the night sky, and the roar of machine guns cutting across the desert like thunder. The men were exhausted, bruised, and burned by the occasional flames, yet each knew they were part of something extraordinary. For them, war had become more than tactics and strategy. It was a test of courage, trust, and human endurance. Every raid was a story of survival, precision, and audacity that blurred the line between man and machine, turning a simple jeep into a platform of destruction and legend. By the end of the North African campaign, the SAS had become a nightmare for the Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica. While historians still debate the exact numbers, it is clear that the British Special Forces had destroyed hundreds of aircraft on the ground, far exceeding expectations and altering the balance of power in the desert. Individual soldiers like Paddy Mayne reportedly accounted for more than 100 planes alone, men whose names became whispers of fear among enemy ranks. The desert had proven to be a crucible where innovation, courage, and sheer audacity could combine to devastating effect. The raids of July 1942 and the months that followed were more than tactical victories. They were proof that small, highly trained units, equipped with speed, firepower, and ingenuity, could achieve results that conventional forces could only dream of. The armed jeep became a symbol, a rolling embodiment of British operational innovation. It forced the Axis to rethink their defenses, to divert resources, and to confront an enemy that could strike anywhere, anytime. For men in a machine-laden vehicle had reshaped the desert battlefield and, in doing so, demonstrated that in war, daring often outweighed numbers, and intelligence often outweighed brute force. The desert had cooled, the echoes of gunfire long faded, but the impact of those blazing nights in 1942 rippled far beyond the sands of Libya. What Germany had spent millions constructing in aircraft, airfields, and training, Britain had destroyed for almost nothing. For men in a groaning, overloaded Willis jeep could undo months of enemy planning in minutes. It was audacity incarnate. A simple vehicle transformed by human ingenuity, improvisation, and courage into a weapon that rewrote the rules of warfare. The SAS armed jeep was more than a tool. It was a blueprint, a progenitor of every special operations vehicle that followed, a symbol of how a few could challenge the many with intelligence, speed, and firepower. The strategic impact was profound. Axis commanders found themselves diverting entire infantry companies to guard airfields that had once been left lightly defended, pulling soldiers from frontline duties to protect rear areas. Every guard posted, every searchlight installed, every anti-vehicle obstacle dug represented resources stolen from the battles that mattered most. Britain had discovered a way to multiply force through ingenuity rather than numbers. A single jeep raid could destroy multiple aircraft in minutes, disrupt supply lines, and force the enemy to rethink their entire defensive posture. It was a new kind of warfare, precise, efficient, and terrifyingly effective. By the end of the North African campaign, British Special Forces had destroyed an estimated 250 to 370 enemy aircraft, the SAS alone accounting for the majority. Individual soldiers like Lieutenant Paddy Mayne reportedly destroyed nearly 100 planes, becoming legends whispered about in German encampments. The raids were more than tactical victories. They were strategic statements, turning the once safe desert into a crucible of fear and uncertainty for the Axis. The lessons of Libya did not vanish when the war ended. When the SAS reformed for the Malayan emergency in 1950, the Land Rover replaced the Willis as the standard patrol vehicle, carrying forward the principles forged in the desert: speed, mobility, and concentrated firepower. By 1968, the Pink Panther, a modified Land Rover Series 2A painted pale pink for desert camouflage, incorporated machine gun mounts, a 100-gallon fuel capacity, and sand recovery tools, proving the SAS had learned from its own history. Each design decision, lightweight, fast, armed to strike decisively, traced back to the improvised jeeps that had first turned the desert into a battlefield of innovation. In the modern era, the SAS Supercat Jackal embodies the same philosophy. Capable of 80 miles per hour over rugged terrain, carrying heavy and general-purpose machine guns, automatic grenade launchers, and deployed by helicopter, these vehicles operate autonomously, striking with precision before vanishing into the landscape. Every armored hull, every weapon mount, every tactical choice echoes the creativity and daring of Sterling, Maine, and the men who first proved that mobility, firepower, and ingenuity could substitute for sheer numbers. What began as a desperate adaptation to a desert dominated by enemy aircraft became doctrine. For men in a jeep had forced the Axis to divert thousands, burned hundreds of aircraft, and left a legacy that shaped every special operations vehicle that followed. It was proof that war was not only about factories and numbers, but imagination, courage, and audacity. The dunes of Libya still hold the memory of those blazing raids, of vehicles groaning under impossible loads, of men who turned a simple car into a weapon that changed the course of battle. And in every SAS vehicle from Land Rovers to Pink Panthers to Supercat Jackals, that spirit lives on, wheels armed with firepower, driven by ingenuity, and carrying forward the unyielding legacy of the desert ghosts who first showed the world what 4 men and 1 jeep could achieve.